Welcome to the first video in our video series. My name is Kate.
I'm Bailey.
And we are going to be diving into a few composers' lives over the next couple of weeks. And we are just trying to create a video that not only educates you on the composer, but also the composition that we will be talking about, just to kind of give you some insight to what was going on in their life during the time of when they were composing this and then when they released. So our first composer that we will be talking about is Claude Debussy. He was born in August 22nd, 1862, and he was also a Leo, just in case you wanted to know that. And he created and paved the way for a lot of Impressionist composers. He was still in the 19th century going into the 20th century, and he would not even consider himself an Impressionist as a whole, but he is still technically one of the very first Impressionists.
So Debussy had a little bit of an unstable family life growing up. His family didn't have a lot of money. His father was originally a shop owner, but eventually the shop wasn't making much money, so it had to close. And at one point, his mother had to move him into his aunt's house. His mother moved as well. So there was a lot of instability with him having to move around with different family members and his parents not making enough money to give him everything that he needed without moving around to different relatives' houses.
And considering all the turmoil that he did experience as a child, he ended up studying at the Conservatory of Paris from the age of 10 all the way to 21. So he was actually given a really awesome opportunity to go and learn how to perform. And this really settled his way in the music situation in Paris at the time.
Tea break. Yes.
His first compositions were around the era of the late 1870s and early 1880s, so he was pretty young when he began composing.
So now that we've talked about all of his music stuff, we're going to get into the juicy details of his romantic life, which everyone wants to know about. So after he graduated and kind of found his way, he started dating, courting, however you want to call that, Gabrielle Dupont in 1893. So this was a good decade after he was done with school and, composing for a while. And they had a live-in relationship together. But go ahead and tell our viewers about their juicy details of him being him.
Yes, so while he was still living with Gabrielle, or Gabby as she went by, in 1894 he began having an affair with a singer named Therese Roger, and they actually got engaged while he was still living with Gabby.
I don't know about you, but I would have dumped him, but that's okay. Yeah. So, after all of that, he makes some poor choices, but back then they kind of just did whatever and it kind of worked. It was frowned upon, but I feel like over in France at the time, all of the love
they were just doing whatever.
So he decides to leave DuPont for her friend, which is horrible. Her name was Lily, by the way, just so if you want to know that. But they ended up getting married, so his first two flings were nothing to him, apparently. And they got married in 1899, so that was a few years after he had just started his relationship with Gabrielle. But they only got married because he was threatening to commit suicide if she decided to leave him. Red flag. So he did get married, but it was... Well, say what you want, and we'll leave it there. We'll move on.
Okay, so as for back to his musical career, he joined a group of different types of artists from different mediums and different backgrounds called Les Apaches, which translates to the Hooligans. Some of the members included Maurice Ravel, Ricardo Vines, Igor Stravinsky, and Manuel de Falla. And we will talk about Igor Stravinsky later into this video. But yeah, that was just some of the people that he was hanging out around when he composed his nocturnes.
So around this time, the piece that we're actually going to be talking about shortly is composed and released, which is his nocturnes. Specifically, we're going to be talking about Nuage, which was composed and published in 1897 through 1899. And according to our anthology, all of Debussy's music that he was composing at the time had just a really interesting characteristics about it. And so around this time of him entering into this phase, he started composing and released the nocturnes that he is so famously known for. And specifically, we're going to be talking about Nuage, which was released from 1897 to 99. And in our nom, it talks about how this orchestral music specifically is a play of musical images, each characterized by instrumental color, motive, pitch collection, rhythm, and register. So this piece in particular kind of gives the viewer and listener, if you're watching the music on a video or if you're just listening to it audibly, you have some kind of image in your head when you're listening to it, and it translates to clouds. So he talks about, has images of clouds, and when you're listening to it, it specifically just brings to mind the lightness and airiness of a lot of the instrumentation. So in the audio clip that we'll be playing here in a short second, you will definitely get to hear that, and then you can make your own assumptions about that, but that is what he had in mind during this time. And he had a lot of conflict in his life at the time as well, so we were talking about just maybe possibly he was just trying to create a different reality for himself because he had lived through a lot of turmoil. So I hope you enjoy.
Okay, so now moving on to Igor Stravinsky. We're going to talk a little bit about him and his Rite of Spring. So we'll start a little bit about his childhood and go into the Rite of Spring era.
So Stravinsky was raised Catholic, and he was a really smart kid, but he just had a really lonely childhood because a lot of kids didn't necessarily get along with him, and he didn't really get along with other kids. So he had a saying in one of his more known quotes, and Bailey's going to read it for us.
He said, "I never came across anyone who had any real attraction for me." So that kind of explains like how he felt as a kid he just felt like he was kind of invisible and no one really cared much for him. So he kind of just went through life working on his studies, but not really caring much about the friendship aspect because he didn't have much luck with that.
He decided to study criminal law and philosophy at the University of St. Petersburg. And this actually, he didn't necessarily have a start to his music life. He went straight into a normal job, as one would look at it. And his father died of cancer in 1902. And then after that, that's when he really started to begin to study music more than law.
He did marry his first cousin, Catherine.
You know who's looking fine tonight? Seth Muksikowski.
Okay, you did not just say that.
What? He's a good kisser.
He is your cousin.
Yeah, but he's my first cousin.
Right.
So you have your cousins, and then you have your first cousins, and then you have your second cousins.
No, honey. Mm-mm.
That's not right, is it?
1905, so do with that what you will.
So we looked at pictures on the internet, and his children look fairly normal, which is kind of surprising considering the whole cousin thing. Good for him. But his first two children were born in 1907 and 1908. And they have very interesting names, if you want to pronounce the two on there.
So they had their son Fyodor and their daughter Ludmila.
And then their third child was born in 1910.
And his name was Svatoslav.
So he was a out of the ordinary family man, one can say. But I mean, hey, whatever works for you. So that brings us to his composition.
So he composed The Rite of Spring, and it premiered in 1913. And it actually caused riots because people were so offended by the choreography in the ballet. And basically, it was less plot-oriented than most ballets, and it was more trying to depict a pagan ritual. And essentially in the movement, the Dance of the Adolescent Girls, a young girl is chosen as a sacrifice, and her position is to dance herself to death. So kind of an out there ballet.
So this piece specifically kind of brought in the Impressionist style, especially because of the amount of dissonance and different clashing sounds, and that also added to the overall theme of what he was trying to show in the ballet itself, and you will hear that in just a few seconds. So
Enjoy if you can.
Okay, now moving on to our last composer that we'll talk about for this first video. We're going to talk about Arnold Schoenberg, and again, a little bit about his childhood and then leading up to the composition that we will be going over.
So he was born to a lower middle class Jewish family, and he lived in the Jewish ghetto right before World War II. And this gave him a lot of different interesting experiences, a lot of them negative, obviously. But this is kind of what prompted him into the music field.
So being from a lower middle class Jewish family a little bit before World War I and II and Holocaust, he was mostly self-taught as a musician, which is honestly amazing that he could come this far as a composer with only himself to teach him the music.
He converted to Christianity in his 20s, and this was kind of a big thing for him, especially because he was Jewish. So we're going to go ahead and talk about his early to mid 20s, and Bailey will tell you about his love life a little bit.
Yes, so he was married, and he actually had some marital problems. His wife cheated on him with a painter named Richard. And then she eventually went back to her husband, and Richard actually killed himself as a result.
That part is not funny. Okay. So, after I'm gonna cut that.
A few moments later.
3, 2, 1.
No.
Okay. After that whole ordeal, with the cheating and the suicide and just a lot of negative emotions towards his love life in general, he decided to join the army during World War I. And during this time, he actually converted back to Judaism. And Bailey's going to talk about his immigration to the U.S. and all that.
Yes, so around the time that he was on vacation in France, the Nazis came to power, and he was informed that his family would no longer be safe if he returned to Germany. So him and his family decided to move to the U.S.
During this time, this is actually when he started his teaching career in music, and he started to grow as a composer, and the U.S. gave him a lot of opportunities that he just didn't have overseas. And also, this isn't the piece that we are going to be talking about, but he did invent which basically is the speaking on pitch, and it is the weirdest sounding thing you'll ever listen to. But so after he came to the U.S., this gave him a really nice opportunity to launch his teaching career and also his music career as a whole. And this is when he really did start to compose more and grow as a musician.
He was actually rejected. His application was rejected as a teacher from the New South Wales Conservatorium because he was Jewish. So he did experience some discrimination from that despite moving to the New South Wales State Conservatorium. Actually rejected his application to be a teacher there because he was Jewish. So he did experience some discrimination because of that, as would be expected during the time that they were in.
He did have a really, really interesting phobia of the number 13, which is called triskaidekaphobia. And unfortunately, he did die on the 13th of whatever month that was. We're not going to talk about that. But we're going to go into his piano suite, Opus 25. And we're just going to talk about that really quick. Now, when you're listening to this, the amount of dissonance in this piece alone just highlights him as an impressionist piano composer. None of this is necessarily easy to listen to. One of his movements is more of a waltz style, and it has rhythmic patterns to it that make it more aesthetically pleasing in a sense, but it's still very dissonant to listen to, and that was what he was going for at this time. This was very common for composers to be more impressionist and getting rid of the old ways of the 19th and 18th centuries before him. So we'll go ahead and listen to that, and thank you.
Thank you guys so much for watching our first video. We talked a lot about the early 20th century up to the 1920s, and in our next video we're going to go through the 1930s up to the 1950s, and specific composers that we'll be talking about will be available on our website before that video is released.